Good day, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the Department of Trade and Industry's Bureau of International Trade Relations for inviting me to do an episode for this webinar series. So today, I'll be discussing an overview of the chapter on trade and services under the Philippines European Free Trade Association Free Trade Agreement, or the PH-EFTA FTA. My presentation will cover the scope of the chapter on trade and services, after which I will be discussing some of the salient features of the services chapter, such as market access, national treatment, and most favored nation obligations, among others. Lastly, opportunities for the parties to take advantage of under this agreement will be presented. Before we proceed with the overview of the chapter on trade and services, let me first discuss the services performance of the Philippines and the EFTA states, namely Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Iceland, in recent years. The country's trade and services have seen accelerated growth as shown in the recent 5-year data from 2015 to 2019. Philippine exports posted a compound average growth rate of 9%, which translates to an average of $34.9 billion US dollars annually. And during the 5-year period, the data shows that the country has been a net exporter of services. As trade surpluses continued to increase each year, this reached a high of 13.06 billion US dollars in 2019 from only $5.45 billion in 2015. On a sectoral level, the country's top services exports are other business services, travel, telecommunications, and manufacturing services. The chapter on services covers measures affecting trade and services, particularly on the 4 modes of supply as defined in the General Agreement on Trade and Services under the World Trade Organization. So before we get into the details of the chapter, I'll just give a crash course on how services are traded through different modes of supply. The 4 modes of supply are cross-border supply, which is mode 1, consumption abroad, mode 2, commercial presence, mode 3, and movement of natural persons, mode 4. To illustrate how services are traded, let's look at the examples on the screen. We will use health as a sample sector for the purpose. So for mode 1, cross-border supply is defined as services flows from the territory of one country into the territory of another country, with both the supplier of the service and the consumer remaining in their respective territories. An example of this is telehealth diagnosis received by a patient in country B from a doctor in country A through digital and communication technologies. Mode 2, consumption abroad, refers to instances where a consumer, probably a tourist or a patient, moves or travels into another country's territory to obtain a service. So under this mode, country B's patient travels to country A to avail of its hospital services. In mode 3, commercial presence means that a service supplier of a country establishes a territorial presence, including through ownership or lease of premises in another country's territory to provide a service. For instance, domestic subsidiaries of foreign insurance companies or hotel chains. For this mode, country A's hospital has set up a subsidiary or a branch in country B so that country B's patient does not need to travel to country A to avail of hospital services. And then mode 4, presence of natural persons, consists of persons of a country entering the territory of another country to supply a service. However, mode 4 does not cover measures regarding citizenship, residence, or access to the employment market on a permanent basis. So to wrap up our health sector example, country A's doctor travels to country B to render or practice medical services on a temporary basis. This chapter covers services sectors defined under the World Trade Organization's Services Sectoral Classification List. The 12 main services sector categories are business services, communication services, construction and related engineering services, distribution services, educational services, financial services, health-related and social services, tourism and travel-related services, recreation, culture and supporting services, transport services, and other services not indicated elsewhere. As adopted in the WTO GATS, the chapter also excludes services supplied in the exercise of governmental authority measures affecting traffic rights and services directly related to the exercise of such rights. The chapter on trade in services incorporated the market access obligation under the WTO GATS. In sectors where market access commitments are undertaken, a country shall not maintain or adopt, unless otherwise specified or stated in its schedule of commitments, the following measures related to market access. A. Limitations on the number of service suppliers, whether in the form of numerical quotas, monopolies, exclusive service suppliers, or the requirements of an economic needs test. B. Limitations on the total value of service transactions or assets in the form of numerical quotas or the requirement of an economic needs test. C. Limitations on the total number of service operations or the total quantity of service output expressed in terms of designated numerical units in the form of quotas or the requirement of an economic needs test. D. Limitations on the total number of natural persons that may be employed in a particular service sector or that the service supplier may employ and who are necessary for and directly related to the supply of a specific service in the form of numerical quotas or the requirement of an economic needs test. E. Measures which restrict or require specific types of legal entity or joint venture through which a service supplier may supply a service, and F. Limitations on the participation of foreign capital in terms of maximum percentage limit on foreign shareholding or the total value of individual or aggregate foreign investment. The chapter also incorporates the national treatment obligation under the WTO GATS. This requires parties to accord to services and service suppliers of any other party with respect to all measures affecting the supply of services treatment no less favorable than that it accords to its own or national like services and service suppliers. The obligation ensures that foreign services and suppliers are given equal opportunities to compete in the domestic market. Measures that are inconsistent or not aligned with this obligation are inscribed in each country's schedule of commitments. Some examples of these discriminatory measures include residency requirements, documentary requirements, in addition to those that are required from own or national service suppliers, and other requirements that own or national service suppliers need not comply with, such as having an understudy. The most favored nation obligation ensures that each party are given preferential treatment to no less favorable than what it extends to services and services suppliers of a non-party. However, it may be noted that this obligation does not include existing and future agreements concluded by the parties. The key feature of this obligation in this agreement is that for future agreements of a party with a non-party, a party may request for adequate opportunity to negotiate for the same preferential treatment given to the non-party. For example, if EFTA countries will forge an agreement with another country, let's say A, in the future, the Philippines will have the opportunity to negotiate for the concessions that EFTA will accord to country A. The services chapter also includes annexes on financial services, telecommunications, movement of natural persons, supplying services, maritime transport and related services, and energy-related services. These annexes contain details of the rights and obligations of the parties in each specific sector or subsector. Out of all the annexes enumerated in the previous slide, let's specifically focus on the annex on maritime transport and related services, since there is a high demand for services of Filipino seafarers worldwide. We see the Philippines benefiting from this annex, which provides rules on the treatment of seafarers. The annex contains additional disciplines on maritime transport and related services. It covers non-discriminatory market access for international maritime transport service suppliers, as well as non-discriminatory treatment with regard to ports access, the use of infrastructure and services in ports such as pilotage, towing, and tug assistance, and provisioning, among others. The annex also provides for recognition of vessel and identity documents of crew, including facilitation of their entry and transit. Further, each party shall allow companies or industry organizations of another party to establish a representation through a recruitment and placement agency on its territory, subject to the latter party's laws, rules, regulations, and policies. This will provide opportunities for Filipino seafarers to link with EFTA market with their recruitment and placement agencies' commercial presence in the Philippines. Lastly, to illustrate the obligation indicated in the annex on the treatment of crew members in cases where a Philippine vessel suffers any damage within territorial waters of EFTA states, EFTA competent authorities are required to extend the same help and assistance to the members of the crew and passengers of the Filipino vessel as it extends to EFTA nationals. The same treatment is expected when an EFTA vessel suffers any damage in Philippine territorial waters. So what did the Philippines gain in terms of trade and services? Here are some of the opportunities available for the Philippines through this free trade agreement. First, EFTA member states made commitments in new services, sectors, or subsectors and made their existing Mode 4 commitments under the WTO General Agreement on Trade and Services more liberal. Opportunities are now available to Philippine services suppliers for both skilled workers and professionals, particularly for architects and engineers via cross-border supply of services, is Mode 1, and movement of natural persons, or Mode 4. Second, the entry and temporary presence of intra-corporate transferees, which includes executives, managers, and specialists or business visitors and contractual service suppliers, will now be allowed in some or all the EFTA member states. Third, there were specific concessions granted by some EFTA countries. For instance, Switzerland opened new opportunities for Filipino installers and maintainers by adding a category of personnel in the form of installers and maintainers in almost all services sector subsectors. And this includes the training of a Filipino counterpart as a contractual requirement. Also, the maintenance, repair, and operations of Swiss aircrafts may now be done in the Philippines. On the other hand, Norway will now allow Filipino independent professionals and graduate trainees to supply services on a temporary basis on almost all services sectors, and in some instances, the economic needs test will be waived. On the other hand, here are some of the opportunities that will be made available to Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Iceland, and Norway through this PH-EFTA FTA. One, the Philippines made commitments on services sectors where additional foreign investments as well as technical expertise would be useful to the country. So this include renewable energy services, computer and related services and financial services, construction services, environmental services, maritime transport services, and financial services. Through the PH-EFTA FTA, Service suppliers from EFTA member states can also enter and stay on a temporary basis in the Philippines without undergoing an economic needs test, particularly in the following categories. One, intra-corporate transferees covering executives, managers, specialists. Two, business visitors. Three, contractual service suppliers. And four, installers and services of industrial machinery, equipment, or both. The latter could enter the Philippines as part of the contract of purchase of a machinery or equipment and includes the contractual requirement to develop local skills through training. So this ends my webinar episode on the Trade in Services chapter under the Philippines EFTA Free Trade Agreement. Hope you learned a lot and may you take advantage of the various opportunities offered under this agreement. Have a great day.